Hey, are you going to have any announcements? I've got the one about Carolyn. Do you have any? Got it down? Oh, no. Land Institute. Okay. Garden Pros. Jessica.
K-L-E-O.
K-A-K-L-E-O. Land Institute.
P-P-E-M.
Kleppel.
Sustainable agriculture.
Ooh.
Should be a good program.
Okay. Okay. Oh, no.
Oh, you know, with all the roads.
Yeah.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of faith, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth, keepers of faith, makers of peace, and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage.
Now I'm going to wait for Jake. Yes. Okay. Welcome. We welcome you, whoever you are and whomever you love. We welcome you whether you ran in on little feet, walked in briskly, ambled in with cane or walker, or rolled in with wheels of wandering. We strive to let you be you in your religious life and hope you join us on our principled but sometimes imperfect journey at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Topeka. Welcome. Before we begin, I want to inform you this service is being streamed and also preserved in electronic form. Please be mindful of this before coming to either of our microphones. A friendly reminder, please turn off all cell phones and other devices at this time so we are not disturbed during the services. You don't want to be that one person that everybody turns around and gives you the stink eye to because you forgot to turn it off. Our ushers can help with hearing devices if you need one. This is our Sunday program, our service if you prefer, for August 7th, 2022. This is the 9th in a series of programs on racial justice offered by the First Sunday team, Lauren Christ, Lou Hoover, Janine Silsby, and me, Vicki George. This team was formed to address the commitment this congregation made when it passed the 8th principle. The 8th principle reads, affirms and promotes journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. As always, the team asks ourselves, and you, so what? Why present this topic here as a Sunday morning service at the location of what we describe as a spiritual home and beacon of liberal religion in Topeka? Our guest speaker today is Dr. Tom Prasch, professor and chair of the History and Geography Department at Washburn University. His scholarly interests focus on Victorian Britain and the British Empire. This is his second appearance in this pulpit, the first being last fall when we talked about critical race theory. Now, announcements. At yesterday's Sunday morning retreat, it was announced that Shawnee County's COVID status is now in the red. While it is dependent upon our board of directors to determine any changes in our response to this news, concern was expressed about any group singing and community meal sharing. Until the board publishes its recommendations, the membership committee, i.e. Jana, Cook, and I, are choosing to postpone next week's second Sunday lunch. And of course, masks are always recommended as we need to protect our vulnerable populations. Judy Salyer wants us to know there's garden produce that you can pick up on the west side table. And Walt Racker, in charge of the program next Sunday, wants us to know that Jessica Klepper from the Land Institute will be talking to us about sustainable agriculture. Are there any other announcements? Hearing none, we move to the child sliding.
For our chalice lighting, we are again using Prayer for Living Intention by Joseph M. Cherry. Your First Sunday team has adopted this as our personal guide. If we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be bold enough to step into our discomfort, brave enough to be clumsy there, loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. May we, as a people of faith, be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving.
Thank you, Lauren. And now I announce me as the story for all ages. So come on up, kids. Okay, is this on? It is. Okay. Now, we're going to have to do some practice first of all, okay? Oh, hands up. Put them together and bring them down. Do you think the adults can learn how to do that? Okay, you five stand up. Let's practice. Come on, adults. Hands up. Class, bring them into your laps. Okay. Oh, you guys didn't do as good as the kids, but that's okay. All right, that's a good start. Okay, down you go. Now, I'm going to be handing you something, and so I either want your hands in your laps, or if you have trouble fiddling with stuff, you can always put them, like the Minions say, under your bottoms. I love the Minions. So here. Oh, you don't know that. You don't know the Minions. Oh. Okay. Take one. Take one. Take one. Take one. Take one. Now, where should your hands be? Should you be doing this with it? Say, no, Miss Vicki. No, Miss Vicki. Should be doing this with it. No, Miss Vicki. Okay. Now, there you go. Way, there's plenty, so don't worry about it, all right? So, how did that feel? How did that feel? I did miss it the first time. How's that feeling if I take these things away from you? I think you're going to say something. I think we have somebody who's going to say something right now. I just need to pull this off so you can speak to it. All right, how's that feel, Stella?
I don't like it, and I'd like them back.
You don't like it, and you like it back, huh? Oh, but there's a please. Okay, pick the one you wanted. Pick the one you wanted. Pick the one. Now, Neve, how did that feel when I was picking those things from other people?
I felt like you were mistreating people, that you were stealing things from some people, but leaving them.
Right. That's very good. So, now the question is, how does that feel when you think that you're losing something? And that's one of the concerns we've got right now in our country, when we've got some people who feel like their privileges are being taken away. And even though, you can see there's plenty here, right? Did it still feel like I was mistreating somebody? Yeah, and like you were losing something. Yeah. And by the way, it's interesting, I'm trying to do some reading on this, and the grief over the perceived loss in your privileges. Sometimes if you lose something, it takes 3 times, I don't know how to say this. Yes. Say that. Okay, here we go again. I'm going to get tied in this thing again. I was going to have a handheld and I didn't. Say that again.
Humans value losses twice as much as wins.
So right now in our culture, of course, we've got a lot of people who are very concerned with losing what they see as their principles. But guys, is there plenty to go around? Are there plenty of other things in this country to go around? What do you want to say, sweetheart? You know what you're going to do? You're going to be taking this back and giving this to Miss Erin, Stella's mom, our director of religious education, and she makes that decision, okay? Not my job. Okay, turn in. Here we go, here we go. And that loss, right? Okay. Now, I believe, Erin, you're going to be singing them out, right? Oh. Elliot.
I don't have pockets.
Now in peace, may the Spirit of God surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Go now in peace, go now in peace, may the Spirit of God surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. So, joys and concerns. Carolyn Ward's mother, Barbara Jean Jones Ward, passed away last Saturday after a 13-year battle with frontal temporal degeneration, FTD. Carolyn and her sister were at her side. As Barbara's last selfless act, brain donation was coordinated with the Harvard Brain Tissue Resource Center to help further research to identify causes, treatments, and hopefully one day cures for devastating diseases, including FTD. The memorial service was held yesterday in Derby, Kansas. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations in Barbara's name to the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. I will have information here at the podium for the address if you're interested. And let me see, today is Rob Cook's birthday. Yeah, he made it. And it sure seems like we should say something about Tuesday's vote. Okay, so yes. Now we will take the offering, and I believe that Erin was going to have some clipboards passed around too, hopefully for help with youth, nursery, or the younger people. So
I saw them on the table outside. If you don't
okay.
Here's a
This next song, I need the podium, please.
Move over.
This is in commemoration of what we already woohooed about. So let's, can we get, did you figure out we could do it without the music first, without the sound?
I can mute it.
Okay, can we get him to then go through it twice that way? Sure. Okay, this is what we're going to be doing.
1, 2, 3.
okay? So they can kind of get used to it. This was done for a UU choir in Minnesota. 1, we see there is a wrong to be righted. 2, we know we are stronger when united. 3, we exercise our right to assemble. 4, that's when the proud and mighty start to tremble. This is in case you're wondering, just in case you're wondering, just in case you're wondering. Hey, hey, look this way. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, we see there is a wrong to be righted. 2, we know that we are stronger when united. 3, we exercise our right to assemble. 4, that's when the proud and mighty start to tremble. Just in case you're wondering, just in case you're wondering, just in case you're wondering. Hey, hey, look this way. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks. Look at Kansas. This is what democracy looks like. Okay, let's start with the music. We got some good drums. All the music is just drums. Okay. And okay, stand up. With the music? With the sound.
Okay, let's get rolling.
It's the kind of things we do at those conferences, guys, so keep sending me.
1, 2, 3, go. 1, we see that there's a wrong to be righted. 2, we know that we are stronger when united. 3, we exercise our right to assemble. 4, that's when the proud and mighty start to tremble.
Before turning the pulpit over to my other teammates and our guest speaker, I want to tell you about my and aha about the topic of the Great Replacement Theory. Actually, less aha and more When Charlottesville happened in 2017, I was confused about the chance Jews will not replace us. Yeah, it's on. Okay.
You need to be closer to it or something, Vicki, because it's hard to hear you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Okay, then I'll start again. Before turning the pulpit over to my other teammates and our guest speaker, I want to tell you about my about the topic of the Great Replacement Theory. When Charlottesville happened in 2017, I was confused about the chance Jews will not replace us. I was thinking, what the? How could a religious minority replace these angry attendees at the Unite the Right? It wasn't until the news around the Buffalo shooting that I heard really heard how this trope about Jews will replace other good Americans was a factor in the Great Replacement theory. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Tom how this all fits together. And now I turn the pulpit over to Lauren.
Lest we think it's not all connected, last Tuesday's amendment and the Great Replacement theory do have a connection. So I'm going to read a little bit from an article by Alex Samuels and Monica Potts from publication 538. The movement to end legal abortion has a long racist history, and like the Great Replacement theory, it has roots in a similar fear that white people are going to be outnumbered by people believed to hold a lower standing in society. Those anxieties used to be centered primarily around various groups of European immigrants and newly emancipated slaves, but now they're focused on non-white Americans. Throughout colonial America and into the 19th century, abortions were fairly common with the help of a midwife or other women. But the dynamics surrounding the procedure changed by the mid-19th century as America's elites began to fear a rising tide of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and other European countries. Suffragettes seeking new freedoms and recently freed Black people, whom these elites feared were reproducing at higher rates than the white population. Laws limiting abortion, it was believed, would ultimately force middle and upper class white women who had the most access to detect and terminate unwanted pregnancies to bear more white children. Fast forward, the white nationalist segment of anti-abortion organizing is really long-standing. And in recent years, there's been more of an emboldenment about using Great Replacement rhetoric or similar kind of rhetoric around to what they might call white genocide or demographic change. Even on its own terms, though, the logic tying the anti-abortion movement to the racist Great Replacement theory is deeply convoluted and downright inaccurate. For instance, fewer women are seeking abortions, and women of color, particularly those who are Black, are more likely than white women to seek an abortion. Moreover, it's likely that we'll see more women of color die as abortions become more limited, in spite of arguments from some on the far right that a near-total abortion ban is a good thing for people of color, primarily Black people. In fact, according to analysis published in December, a hypothetical total abortion ban would lead to more pregnancy-related deaths among non-Hispanic Black people than any other racial group. But logic is not the point in many of the mainstream racist arguments around restricting abortion access. They tried to twist themselves into logical scientific explanations for all these things, but they basically had to make up stuff to justify what they wanted, which is for women, especially women of color, to not have any rights.
It is a well-known fact that if demographic trends in the U.S. continue on course, this will no longer be a majority white nation by somewhere around 2040. Tucker Carlson, commentator on Fox News, says this is a very bad thing. Not that he is racist, oh my no. He says that replacing us is a deliberate policy of the Democratic Party so that Democrats can win more elections. I'm not kidding. I have been examining the transcript of one of Mr. Carlson's diatribes. He began by speaking of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Now that act, passed largely by the efforts of Democrats, corrected some egregiously racist policies in our prior immigration laws. Oddly enough, Mr. Carlson did not go on to outline how the changes in the Immigration Act caused the current demographic changes in the USA. I am guessing that the reason he didn't was because it didn't. He apparently only mentioned the Immigration Act to establish the implication that Democrats are to blame. He then moved on to the real crux of the issue, which is that birth rates among white Americans have fallen so low More are dying than are being born. He claimed that birth rates among white Americans are low because they are unhappy, presumably because of the Democrats. If they were happy, he says, they would have more children. Now that is upside down from what I was taught. People who are secure financially and socially have fewer children. Scientists have expressed concerns for many years that industrialized nations would eventually have birth rates that are too low and their populations would begin dropping. And that is now happening in Europe and in this country among people of European descent. It is thanks to immigrants and non-white citizens that we have enough workers, well, almost enough workers, and taxpayers to keep this country going. Mr. Carlson's ideas make no sense, but he has a slick, sincere-seeming delivery that can be convincing to those willing to be convinced. He has even dug up a few clips of easily recognizable Democrats speculating that demographic changes in this country might make it easier for them to be elected. The thing is, embracing demographic change and hoping it might benefit your political party is not the same thing as causing demographic change. Embedded in the culture of this country is the Christian idea of caring for those less fortunate, of embracing the stranger, of extending kindness. Mr. Carlson's rhetoric poisons the water for kindness. Legislators, whether Democrat or Republican, will pay a price for being kind to immigrants. At a time of demographic change, if we want to weather this change without disruption, we should be living up to the ideals of the melting pot. We should be establishing ever more firmly that we are all in this together, that we need to respect each other and solve problems together. Mr. Carlson would have us at each other's throats. Mr. Carlson, you are wrong. And now we will hear from our speaker.
And a lot of this you'll have already just gotten previewed, just by the way, but if we can get the slides up. What I'm going to do here while we're waiting for the slides is try to give you some historical context on both other sorts of movements that have had these sort of parallels in the past, but also the specific strain of the Great Replacement theory, which interestingly comes from a gay erotica writer in France. Probably most of the white nationalists who cite him don't know that. But Great Replacement theory. Okay, next slide. We know this above all else from probably a couple places. One of them Phyllis has just alluded to. Charleston, where the tiki-bearing neo-Nazis were saying, you will not replace us, but then Jews will not replace us, which I think the response we've already had alluded to of, what? How does that 1.5% do that, right? Is an appropriate one, but it reflects that kind of neo-Nazi rhetoric. And then secondly, next slide. Tucker Carlson. Really interesting New York Times analysis has in fact pinpointed 400 times in which he's made allusions to this theory between 2016 and the present. And of course, for Tucker Carlson, the language has shifted. It's not Jews anymore that are the culprit, it's Democrats. Though we can notice that the two kind of squeeze together in the minds of the alt-right and things like that. But still, he's probably the major single promoter of this theory today. But in thinking about this, next slide, we should keep in mind that there's nothing new here. That in fact, going back to the 1850s with the Know Nothing Party, organized against foreigners. Now, 1850s, keep in mind, black populations are still enslaved. Latino populations weren't part of the discourse yet. But the concern here was of new immigrants coming from new places, above all else, Catholic places, so Irish immigrants above all else, but also Italians, some Southern European immigrants. Those were the concerns of the day. The language is strikingly similar. These will be the people that replace us. Their culture will replace our culture. White Anglo-Saxon culture is under threat. And so this is already part of American rhetoric back in the 1850s. Next slide. And probably the biggest single movement here that really pushes all these things forward is the eugenics movement. Good genes are kind of the root word there. This is Francis Galton's theory, the English cousin of Charles Darwin, who came up with this theory in the first place. And exactly as we've already heard, this is about concern that the right people aren't having enough children, and that the wrong people are. There are class dynamics, race dynamics here. All of those are playing into this. One of the things we can notice is, next slide, that what sounds like a fairly positive theory, just the good people have more children, choose your marriage person right, choose your spouse correctly, also feeds into some pretty negative sort of consequences pretty quickly. Among them, concerns with race specifically crop up very early in the eugenics movement, lead to things like sterilization programs in prisons targeting minority populations, lead probably above all else in the United States to anti-miscegenation laws, banning cohabitation between the races. And that map on the right shows when these laws disappeared in the United States. The green states are the ones that never had them. For the yellow states, they are gone by the mid-19th century or the later 19th century. The orange states, they disappear in the earlier 20th century. All those red states, the anti-miscegenation laws don't go away until Loving versus Virginia, until the Supreme Court decision much, much later in the 20th century. So the consequences of those kind of eugenics propositions stay around in the United States for a very long time. Next slide. We also get a kind of new wave of still broadly eugenic language-based, but newly concerned with a different wave of immigrants, a set of arguments being espoused in the early 20th century. The two kind of classic examples, Grant's book, The Passing of the Great White Race, which explicitly argues that demographic changes are going to lead to a replacement. He doesn't use those words, but the idea is still already there. And then Lathrop Stoppard similarly arguing the rising tide of color. These are interesting sort of ideas. This is, early 20th century, a period of intensely great immigration to the United States of, again, new populations. In this case, many of them, Italian, Spanish, Southern European populations, Balkan populations, places like that. This is that period of mass immigration in the United States. And this is, again, a response that sees this as a fundamental threat, not just to American values, but to actual races. And interestingly, this kind of language of the passing of the white race, Grant, by the way, firmly endorsed by Henry Cabot Lodge, one of the big names of Republican Party politics in this period. These ideas kind of reverse the traditional race thinking of the 19th century, which is that white races will triumph and the other ones will die out. The exterminationist discourse, which essentially justified both American policy against the Native Americans, but also things like the disappearance of Australian Aboriginals and things like that elsewhere. That kind of notion that lesser races will die out is suddenly interestingly reversed, and it's the white race that is under threat in these theories, right? Next slide, please. And we see a new wave of this in the 1930s with the rise of the Klan, the new rise of the Klan. This is the one that William Allen White fought against in Kansas. And again, the language here is very explicitly about race and nation, about preserving race and nation by excluding the people that are a threat to it. In this case, this is initially a response to essentially the empowerment of blacks in the immediate wake of the Civil War. But in the 20s, it's also kind of these new immigrant threats again that are the key kind of focus. And this is also the period of Laughlin's anti-Semitic radio talks and things like that. Next slide. And then, interestingly, America first becomes a big slogan with Charles Lindbergh's group right around the time of the outset of World War II, mostly among people that had pro-Hitler sympathies trying to keep America out of World War II. That's their explicit purpose. But again, we get this rhetoric about race kind of inserted into the American dialogue. And by the way, on the right there, yes, that's Dr. Seuss doing an unusually, he stopped being political later on, but Dr. Seuss saying, when the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children and it didn't really matter. He's targeting those American first ideas in a kind of interesting way. So, first point to make here, and it's a fairly simple one, this isn't new for us. This language of the replacement and the threat to white race and all the rest of that stuff has been part of the American heritage going back to the 1850s. We should notice that the specific targets tend to shift, right? That in the 1850s, they're worried about Italians and Irishmen. That in the 1920s and 30s, they're worried about blacks and new immigrants from other regions. That the anti-Catholic kind of screed of the 19th century is still there for the Klan, but that the focus has shifted towards blacks and Latinos more. So there are shifting targets here. Who threatens the white race is always kind of there, but this has been part of our language for a very long time. And it tends to always work by this kind of interesting sort of fuzziness between race and values, which equate a set of values with white people, and it's sometimes the values that are under threat, and then that tends to kind of segue into the race itself being under threat. There will be a passing of the white race, right? And to use Grant's language here. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, if we look to the modern context, if we look at what's happening right now in this discourse, interesting roots here go to France. Next slide. Oops, one more. We see this still cropping up in the Turner Diaries, which have become kind of a Bible for neo-Nazi and right-wing movements ever since it came out in 1978. Neo-Nazi roots, although it was issued anonymously, predicting race war. And kind of hypothesizing separate parts of the country for separate races as a kind of final apocalyptic outcome, right? Okay, now next slide. The current dynamic has its roots in this guy. Camus, no relationship to Albert, by the way. A French writer. He lives in this kind of 14th century manor off in the countryside, and he's been a prominent writer for a long time, writing kind of gay erotica with a fairly literary sort of gloss to it, and travel writing for decades. But he kind of underwent a conversion in the late 1990s. Above all else, he cites, and the New Yorker piece about him is very good on the details about this, and I think you got a set of readings for this. But the New Yorker did a kind of analysis of his roots. And for him, Montpellier, in the middle of France, he encountered at a fountain in the middle of this old medieval city a group of veiled Muslim women, and he became convinced that they were replacing us. That essentially Frenchness was being obliterated by these immigrants, and that it was even in the countryside, that it was in the cities like in the banlieues of Paris was familiar, but that it was really replacing things throughout the countryside. And so he writes The Great Replacement, the book in 2011, that firmly formulates this theory, right? And he's very kind of interesting and kind of slippery on issues of race. He insists that he doesn't have a genetic logic for race at all. that leaves us wondering what he means by race, but never mind that. He's also slippery on this values thing. He essentially formulates this as identitarian politics, in which white identity is what is under threat, in which, in his case, French identity is under threat. And it's these new groups, above all else Muslim groups, that are threatening it. Now, it's worth noting, next slide, that if we're going to take this seriously in France, he hasn't got much of a case. The minority population in France is minuscule. And even if you look at Muslim populations in Europe, in France, it's well under 10%, right? So, replace? I mean, there's not much real replacement going on here, even if you can find veiled Muslim women at a fountain in Montpellier. It's not like that's changing everything, right? But this theory has been translated and spread fairly widely. In Europe, it has become a kind of gospel to the French right, Le Pen's party. In Hungary, you've probably all seen the coverage of Viktor Orchak at the CPAC conference, reciting his anti-gay screed after having 2 days before said there should be no race mixing. Poland, this has become a kind of big thing there, and also America. If we look at the American incarnation, of course, mouthpieces and the far right, alt-right kind of circuits, and then, of course, Tucker Carlson have been spreading this fairly widely. So let's look at how this spreads to America. Next slide. Oops, wrong century. We'll go forward one more. Next slide. So in America, this catches on fairly widely among these alt-right movements. It informs the people marching in Charleston. It informs the Fox viewership as we see it in Tucker Carlson. Next slide. But it informs very distinctly in terms of partisan breakdown, right? As you can see from these graphs, the people who believe in this very strongly are organized by what TV network they watch. Right, so that graph on the right shows that OAN people believe it almost 50%, right? Fox News, well over 30. People who watch MSNBC don't pay too much attention to it. It also breaks down on the left by partisan lines. This is much more an issue with Republican Party and especially Trump voters within the Republican Party. Next slide. And this kind of breaks this down, and we won't worry about the details here, but it feeds into a range of kind of cultural issues here. Partisan splits on race. The people in this country are trying to replace native-born Americans. That's the kind of fundamental premise. But then declining political influence of native-born Americans, discrimination against white people, those are the other things being charted here, right? So we see that this feeds into a range of cultural fears. And it kind of comes down to that story that the kids were told about losing privilege and all that stuff. It connects to those things very closely, right? If we try to break this down and really analyze what's going on, next slide, please. I think we can see three things going on here. First is that demographic shift. But exactly what we mean by that demographic shift is a little ambiguous, and we'll get to that later. Above all else, a demographic shift in which a growing population is minority population doesn't mean that the white population is being replaced. It takes actual genocide to do that, and that's not happening here, and no signs that it is, right? And so even at that level, there's some problems. But still, that threat of demographic change, right? And then secondly, and this is something you already heard kind of talked about just under the surface in the last two presentations, this notion that populations equals values, right? This is very firmly part of Camus' argument in France that these Muslims can't possibly adapt to Frenchness, right? That they will always oppose it, that they can't blend in, right? And here too, that essentially these outsiders will replace the traditional values of America, that they can't possibly adapt to them, that those values are, of course, fixed and unchangeable in themselves. All of these are kind of problematic assertions, but this notion that populations bear values, that black people or Hispanic people or whatever you want to talk about have a different set of values than we have, that we always a kind of problematic proposition here, right? And so those are the first two sets of those propositions. The third proposition is that there is a conspiracy here, that someone is doing this on purpose. In the most alt-right versions of this, it's the old villain here, it's the Jews. Yeah, and we hear that in that Charleston chat. Jews will not replace it. They're the people that are behind all this. And it goes back to your classic Jewish conspiracy theory, right? In Tucker Carlson, it's been cleaned up at least a little bit, but it's now Democrats. It's explicitly Democratic policy that is doing this. They are doing this to us. The us, of course, always problematic, but there's always this conspiracy. Or George Soros, he gets called out by Victor Orchak, among others. Whoever. And in a sense, it doesn't matter because these segue into each other, these blur together in interesting ways. And those of you who know kind of right-wing rhetoric will recognize this, that when Adolf Hitler talks about Bolsheviks, we know he's also talking about Jews, that those essentially become identical categories. The same sort of thing is going on here. So yes, Tucker Carlson has cleaned it up by not talking about Jews, but he's still sort of implying Jews, and some of his readers or listeners will hear it that way, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Now, if we look for the evidence here, first, the next slide. For demographic shift, we do have clear evidence. This is happening, right? And what is happening is that America, by relatively soon, in the next 20 or 30 years, will not any longer be a majority white country, right? We can already notice several sort of problems, however, if we accept this demographic shift as fact, right? That doesn't mean anybody in particular is aiming to do it. That doesn't imply the conspiracy theory at all. But it is happening, right? But what does it mean? For one, we should notice that it means at least two things, and it's worth separating them out. One of them is birth rates, and this was alluded to earlier too, that certain populations have relatively low birth rates and certain populations have higher birth rates, and that will change the population dynamics if no one comes in at all, right? And that had been going on already even before current debates about immigration. And then second, immigration, right? Which, since the changes in the Immigration Act in the mid-1960s, has in fact tilted more towards racially diverse populations, though less so than you might think. The number of immigrants we are getting from Africa is really strikingly low, right? But still, you will notice here, if we're just looking at white population, right, it is less than 50% within the next 20 years. No doubt about that. We can throw in the big caveat here. What do we mean by white population anyway? Do we count all the blacks who are partially white? Because that's counting all the blacks, right? Do we count those Irish because they were not white the last time we did this back in 1850? What we mean by white, the notion that these are clear, coherent categories is problematic from the start. But sure, if we're going to talk about these categories, there is a demographic shift, and there's evidence for it, and it's definitely happening, right? But what does that mean about those next two things, the values question or the question of who's behind this? What evidence do we have of either of those? Next slide, please. There we go. That's the evidence we have of either of those. The notion that values equals populations is undermined by pretty much anything we look at. Cuban American voting practices. Black church thought about things like the abortion issue. All kinds of things undermine the notion that values equals population in any kind of clear-cut way, right? And that conspiracy theory, as we've already heard, the notion that the Democrats are behind this is just not supported. The notion that the Jews are behind this, that's a myth, right? So the evidence of the other two components are largely absent. But we should note that this theory has really decisive, definite consequences. And the most clear of those, next slide, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the shooting in El Paso, the shooting in Buffalo. Every single one of these shootings, with multiple dead in each time, are carried out by people that are specifically in their manifestos, in their social media posts, articulating great replacement theory, and are specifically targeting minority groups so that this is their contribution to alleviating this, to starting the Great Race War, whatever. So this is theory that has real consequences in real time, in the real world, and somehow Tucker Carlson never talks about this. And so that's what I have to say about this. I'd be happy to take questions, or we can use this as an opportunity to shift towards discussion. Thank you.
Thank you again. Now it's your turn to ask our guest speaker or make an observation. Now again, I want to inform you, this service is being streamed and also preserved in electronic form. Please be mindful of this before coming to the microphone.
This is a sort of comment, sort of question. Remembering many years back, it seemed to me that there was broad support for the Dreamers, for DACA, and it seemed like they were almost going to pass something that would protect these young people. Now it seems like there's much more opposition to it, and I assume that has to do with great replacement theory and beliefs about that.
That's a really good question. The question was, a while ago it seemed like DACA, the Dreamers, the children of immigrants who were trying to gain permanent status in America, had some broad, even bipartisan support, and that has sort of vanished at this point, and whether great replacement theory has much to do with that vanishing, I would be a little hesitant to lay it at that particular door. I think you're right about the consequences. I think the broad support for the Dreamers that existed even a decade ago seems to have largely dissolved. I would say it's more a product of this really bipolar partisanship of the current environment in Washington, more than specifically this theory. That Republicans are so in lockstep on everything means that stripping a few of them away to support something like that is less likely to happen. I don't think that's necessarily to do with the replacement theory, though it's worth saying there are people in Congress who firmly are on this side, who Marjorie Taylor Simpson is a firm believer in the great replacement theory. There are others in Congress who are. But I suspect it's more the dynamic of partisan politics that's blocked the road for the Dreamers to really gain full status. But you're right. I think it's going nowhere right now. And it's truly unfortunate that that wasn't resolved.
Is this on? Even more broadly, the whole idea of reforming immigration and doing something about all the people we see crossing the river and arriving here in very dangerous ways that some don't survive. You know, that's a big problem that needs to be solved. And to what extent does great replacement theory poison the waters for that?
Okay. There, I think we are on better ground. It does. And the clearest evidence of this is that a number of the significant movers and shakers in the Trump administration who were really devising the formulas that blocked a lot of immigration for 4 years. Stephen Miller is the most obvious case. Richard Spencer, who has an enormously important advisory role to Trump administration officials. They are firmly behind this theory. And that has, among other things, the most obvious thing is the current American policy is in violation of international law on refugees. And that's a product of this kind of theory. I think that's true. It's also true that partisan divide is one of the main blocks to anything like a comprehensive immigration bill, whether or not we have this theory in the background. But you're right that some of the current blocks to immigration have their origins in this. And the current administration, Biden's administration, has been kind of weak getting those pulled back down.
How much of this is related to the haves versus the have-nots? Because in my understanding, a lot of the immigrants that came in the first part of the 20th century built, a lot of wealth and establishment, and then instead of keeping some of the same values kind of converted once they had to a much more conservative standpoint. That's just my general thought process, but it then, I look at Trump's son-in-law who's Jewish, and it makes no sense. So can you comment on that?
And by the way, for someone asking about Jewish questions, Fiddler on the Roof t-shirt is perfect. We can all do If I Were a Rich Man at the end here, right? Which kind of gets to your question. I think certainly it's the case that broadly speaking, the pattern of American immigration is that people come in poor, and if they make it, end up kind of accommodating to American life in a way that utterly destroys that values populations argument that's being made earlier. And that's pretty broadly true, I think, in a lot of ways. Probably a particular way we can look at that is the interesting failures of socialism to ever really get any kind of grip in American politics, even though a lot of immigrants came in, especially in the early 20th century, with clearly socialist ideas. That kind of gets filtered out as people, adapt to a more American mainstream view of politics and view of the possibility of capitalist society. I think all of that's true. I think the other interesting side of that, and a really complicated one, has to do with who this theory is pitched toward. And this comes back to that kind of loss of privilege set of issues that we had in the children's story. In really interesting ways. And this is true for both France and America, by the way. The French incarnation of this has a lot to do with the failure of mainstream politics in France to address kind of a shift in the economic circumstances there. And that whole Yellow Jackets movement from a couple of years ago clearly showed that a whole bunch of people felt the utter failure of the system. And those are the people who tend to also be buying into great replacement theory. We see similarly, certainly the elites that are pushing this, the Tucker Carlsons, who's very rich these days, the Jared Kushner's, I don't know what he does with his Jewish roots, the Bannon, who's hanging out on his friend's yachts. Those people certainly aren't in any sense deprived, but a whole strong proportion of the backing for this theory are people who have been left behind by the kind of economic adjustments Some people call this neoliberal. I have an enormous resistance to that because I think that's become a kind of arbitrary label that doesn't have any real meaning, and any label that includes both Margaret Thatcher and Hillary Clinton can't really mean much. But you know, something about the current economic situation, which you can see as kind of Bill Clinton's style of democratic politics, Blair's in England as a kind of counterpart to it, that essentially embraces a kind of globalism that comes at some cost to American workers, hasn't really been redressed and has led to growing gaps of income and things like that. And in some ways, this threat of replacement is really less about race than about economic status, which is a harder thing to address, and so it becomes easy to find race as your excuse for it. But I think that's a really good question and observation.
Well, my name is Walt Racker. Thank you for a really good, thought-provoking conversation. On the subject of eugenics, I want to remind you that the Unitarians' hands are not real clean. Many of our leaders in the 1920s were very supportive of that. I suppose it's a logical extension of the progress that was made in animal husbandry. By selecting the right crowds, we can get better results for everybody. So I think we need to study our own history a little bit. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point, and I think the eugenics movement in the late 19th century, both here and in Britain, was strikingly bridged partisan divides in really interesting and complicated ways. Galton, the guy who came up with the term, is a sort of interesting example here. But probably even more Carl Pearson, who had enormous weight on both sides of the Atlantic, who is in most senses a pretty progressive guy. But on eugenics, he ends up kind of endorsing these theories that come back to race in a kind of fundamental way. And you're right, the fairly progressive churches of the late 19th century tended to kind of embrace eugenics as a way forward, led to those good health booths at state fairs. Kansas State Fair had one for decades, right? Now, the darker side of it that leads to sterilizations in prison, miscegenation laws, and eventually Hitler, you know, how those two shade into each other is a kind of interesting and complicated question, too.
I think time for one more. Come on up, Nancy.
I know you've spoken really well, and I appreciate this. Makes my mind think. But one area, I know we did demographics, politics, economics, but today, I know there's a long history of religious aspect, but today, how is religion playing into this? One of the things that hurt my heart when they took the kids away from parents in the immigration part, she didn't hear anything from the religious community. So how is religion playing a part in moving this theory, this replacement theory, and mixed in with all of that?
That's a really good question, and I share with you that kind of despair that religious leaders were less vocal about separation of children, which seems like, how could they possibly be silent about that? I think the answer is pretty complicated. On the one hand, there's a lot of evidence for a fairly close embrace between an evangelical right, or at least some leadership within the evangelical right, and the far right fringes of the Republican Party, which has some roots in essentially the rollback of the racism of the mid-20th century with anti-discrimination, the whole civil rights movement, and in some ways as a response to that, as a way of reinscribing that again. But I think it's also kind of complicated right now. I will illustrate two ways in which it's really complicated. One, Donald Trump. To take Donald Trump, as many on the far right have, as some sort of representative of a savior from all this, given his own utter irreligion, The fact that he's somebody that can talk about 2 Corinthians, I mean, come on, who hasn't been in a church for years, who has probably paid for more abortions than most of the rest of us combined. I mean, Trump as a representative of this is just baffling. But he's still taken as, a hero for this exact movement, right? The neo-Nazis are, kind of routinely say, well, he can't come out and say he's one of us, but he's one of us, right? That's their take on him. So that's baffling. But on the other hand, just in the last few years, there's been a lot of interesting press, if you really look for it, about the dissatisfaction of younger evangelicals with this kind of right-wing association of evangelical churches over, above all else, issues with the queer community, over the failure to embrace LGBTQ rights by evangelicals. So there might be some divides opening up there that are kind of fortuitous and hopeful in some ways. Might bring more people to this church. I don't know. But, yeah. So it's a complicated picture. And I will say religion is not one of my strong points as a historian. We should get Alan Behrman in here to talk about that. Our Dean of Libraries does the history of U.S. religion and has done it broadly. He's published on Puritans. He's spent time in the Billy Graham archive. It would be interesting to see what he had to say about this.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm going to take the privilege of the pulpit being in the planning committee and make one more comment. And that's something I've been thinking of since I learned about great replacement theory and we started talking about this. And that is with our the cultural things that have been going on in terms of, one, for a long time I've thought about, and I'm thinking about movies and TV and how this gets into that, even for liberals. And one is the movie Idiocracy. If you've not seen it, you should. And in that great replacement theory, all the people with education and smarts get replaced by the stupid people. It's not a race thing. The president is black in that. So, but he's not real bright, and neither is anybody else. And that's an old movie, but more recently, all of the like Marvel movie where we're going to be replaced by aliens and we got to fight off the aliens. How great replacement theory is that? And then, but of course, we win in the end. And then Westworld. If any of you are watching Westworld, where we're being replaced by humanoid robots, it's in the culture, and it's in our entertainment culture. And so that I think that's a way that it gets more acceptable for some people to accept it because they've been watching this stuff for a long time, that we got to watch out for that. Okay. I had to say that. Now, music. I just want to say something about the music. We are getting pay for the fair usage for these. I just want to mention, some of you that may not remember, the first thing that we did this morning, the We Are, was the woman that was singing is Issei Barnwell. She was an original founding member of Sweet Honey in the Rock, and she is a UU. And the one here at the end, the one in the middle, was done for a UU choir in Minneapolis. This last one, you've seen her a lot. She is also a UU. So, and, they let UUs use their stuff. So, whoops. Thank you. Thank you.
Your heart wide open. Those waves wanna push you around. You got to
So thank you, Dr. Tom, and coffee time.